Um, Number 3, a poet can use a specific speaker. He can use a specific audience. If I think about this one poem where there was a poet who wanted to, who seemed to want to suggest that really mundane, really very normal human moments can be kind of infused with a ton of meaning depending on the situation. That really mundane moments can be incredibly meaningful seems to be something that's suggested through this poem. And how that happens is he describes a son arm wrestling his father and winning for the first time. Ask me for the poem if you'd like to read it. It's called Wrist Wrestling Father. And the son basically says, listen, I have done all of these amazing things in my life. I've been fly fishing in exotic areas. I've played music with famous people, but nothing has compared to that moment when I brought my father's hand down to the table. That there's nothing inherently meaningful about this action, and yet something about beating your father in an arm wrestle for the first time suggests that these mundane moments can be infused with meaning. I think it's only possible for him because he chooses a specific speaker and a specific audience, this father and son. So we got to ask for our poem, My Papa's Waltz, why is there who is the speaker, and why was this specific speaker chosen? And in this, it's fairly simple. We know that it's a child, and it's a small child because he's short enough that when that his right ear is at the height of the belt buckle. He suggests that there's so much whiskey on his father's breath that a small boy could be dizzy, seeming to kind of imply that he may be a small boy like that. And then he's whisked off to bed, or he's waltzed off to bed, and so we know that he's young enough that his father so puts him to bed. So we've got this really little kid, and we wonder, why would a poem like this be read by a child? Something seems to be wrong, and then it's read by a child. And I wonder if you're thinking the same thing that I'm suggesting, or the same thing that I'm implying here, that maybe there is something wrong. And maybe because the speaker is a child, they're unaware of it. Maybe they're too naive to see what's really going on. We're going to come down to sound and poetic device in a minute, and I'm going to say that sound matters, that the way a word sounds actually changes the meaning. And so we look at a word like waltz and we say, but Mr. Baird, that's a beautiful word. This is my papa's waltz. It's not something sinister. It's not something dark. It's a beautiful dance. But I think that our poet has chosen a naive, young speaker on purpose. I wonder if he's chosen somebody who would have no idea what's going on, who's speaking to an audience, a father who would understand what's happening, but he's a speaker who wouldn't. Let me throw one more piece of evidence in there, and we'll debate about it tomorrow, as I'm excited to do. We also see in the second stanza that the mother is frowning. The only other person in the poem who's an adult who would know what's actually happening is not happy. In a poem of 16 lines, to have 2 lines devoted to a character who's not actually part of the dance seems to be crucial to me. Why would the mother not be happy? There are 2 adults here. One is not happy. The other is actively involved in the waltz, and the speaker doesn't know what's going on. Had Rothke chosen a different speaker, he may not have been able to get across that something was wrong yet in the context of this beautiful waltz. Finally, we have sound and poetic device. I often give my classes this example. I say, imagine a little girl, we'll call her Lucy, and let's imagine she's 4 and she's having a birthday party and she's wearing this red dress and she's spinning and she's letting it kind of float in the air and she's loving the attention she's getting, and imagine her with blonde little pigtails and just a ton of joy and a ton of fun as all of her family and friends have kind of come to celebrate her birthday. Well, now imagine that someone comes up to her and says, "Hi Lucy, how are you?" And maybe it's somebody she doesn't always see but does like. And imagine this sentence. Imagine I'm writing this story and I write this sentence. I say, Lucy giggled and her cheeks turned red. And I'm going to use a simile here. You can refer to your poetic device handouts to see which different poetic devices I want to make sure you know. But one of them is simile. It's a comparison between two unlike things. I'm going to compare Lucy's red cheeks with something. She giggled and her face turned red like blood. Is that a good choice? And of course it isn't. This is a sweet little birthday party. Blood is a terrible choice. But there's two words we need to understand here. When we're talking about sound and poetic device, and when we come back to my Papa's Waltz, it's going to make a little bit more sense. The first word is connotation, and the second word is denotation. Now, a denotation, for a word's denotation is its direct meaning or its definition. So for blood, the denotation would be a liquid that flows through the body, or even a red liquid that flows through the body. I know that sometimes it's blue, but connotation is the indirect meaning, or those things associated with a word, an associated meaning, a meaning that is kind of attached to but not direct. So when we talk about blood, the denotation makes sense. The girl's cheeks are red. Blood is red. That makes sense. And yet we know that the connotation of blood has something to do with pain or violence. Of course, there's giving blood or blood donations that seem to connote it with life. But for the most part, if I say Lucy giggled and her cheeks turned red like blood, the connotation is a darker one than is suggested by the story. And so I should say something different. I should say her cheeks turned red like strawberries, or something like that, something that indicates the sweetness of the situation. When we talk about a poetic device, when a poetic device is used or how a poetic device is used is going to be really important. So too is the sound of a word. A guy named Lewis Carroll, who was a mathematician but also a children's writer, wrote a poem called The Jabberwocky, in which he tries to describe a mythical world. He's also written Alice in Wonderland, where he does the same thing. He creates this mythical world. But he starts with a whole stanza that has very few English words. It reads, "'Twas brillig, it was brillig. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mumras outgrabe." No English there, and yet he tries to create this whole scene just using the sounds of words. And I think, go ahead and read the poem, I think he's fairly successful. I think he recognizes that the sounds of a word has meaning. And so as we come back to my Papa's Waltz, now recognizing that sound is a part of the form of poetry, as is poetic device, we have to look at things like, "But I hung on like death," line 3. "The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy." I know it wouldn't fit the rhythm very well, but could he not have said, "But I hung on like Velcro," or "I hung on like something else that's a little less sinister than death"? We've gone through rhyme, rhythm, speaker, and we've suggested, is something wrong here? And now we look at poetic device and we say, the boy's hanging on like death. How come? How come? Is something happening here? Is the poet, we ask why. Why would the poet choose the word death? Is he again trying to suggest to us that perhaps this is not what it seems to be when you hear waltz? She giggled and her face turned red like blood. Suddenly, what seems to be a beautiful party and a beautiful scene, something innocent, takes on a completely new nature. Her face turned red like blood, and suddenly the connotation has changed. But I hung on like death, I would argue, does something very similar. It changes the nature of the sentence. It changes the nature of the waltz, of the picture itself. We could go on. We could talk about the sound of the word romped. We could talk about the word waltz itself and argue about why such a beautiful word would be in a poem where something seems to be wrong. But for the sake of time, I'm going to allow us to do that in our follow-up conversation tomorrow. We're looking at form and content. in my Papa's Waltz, and we're suggesting that the off rhyme may imply that something is not right here. That the rhythm, the missed beat that we find at the end, skews what seems to be kind of a perfect waltz-like iambic trimeter. That again, something's wrong. That we have a naive speaker and the only other adult seems to not be happy. We have a child here and they may not understand what's going on. And finally, we're suggesting that the sound of the words and the poetic devices like death that have been chosen are not adding to the waltz-like nature of the story. I'm going to suggest this. I'm going to suggest that perhaps this is more a story of abuse than a story of dancing. And it's a story of a child who doesn't see that and of a mother who does. This is a father who's come home drunk with whiskey on his breath and dirt on his hands, and he's a rough man who treats his son equally roughly in his drunken state. So roughly that pans fall off the shelf, that mom isn't happy. I'm excited about arguing about that with you tomorrow, because I think that there are other implications that may not be quite as compelling to me, but maybe more compelling to you. And I'm excited to see you use form, how the poem is made, to suggest maybe a different implication. Hopefully you've understood the difference between form and content a little bit more, and hopefully as we go into some of the other poems that we're looking at, that can start to become part of the fabric of our discussion. This may be a video you want to watch more than once, especially the rhythm section. Good luck.